This is He Who Moans, Doctor Who reviews. I only complain because I like Doctor Who and I care. And I overanalyze too much because, whatever, it's just my opinion. So, Series 2 of the 8th Doctor Adventures on Bigfinish, which featured the end of the line for low prices, the pulling of a few trump cards, a couple of divisive ones, and an awesome addition from the Companion Chronicles series several years later. I can tell you now that this video is probably not going to be dignified in any way and will probably end up a collage of squeeing fanboyism and difficult skirting around the issues, squirming, yes, I know, but I still kind of like it for some reason that I can't really articulate. Weirdly enough though, we're starting out with one that I'm just kind of lukewarm on, and I don't seem to be alone on that. Invaders from Mars is our next straight-up sci-fi historical, and it's a great idea. I will give it credit for that at least. If you didn't expect Doctor Who to do a sci-fi historical about the famous Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcasts, asking, on the night that millions of Americans are convinced that aliens are actually invading Earth, what if they weren't imagining it? Then I'd start wondering what the hell is wrong with you, as it's quite an obvious idea. I'm actually pretty surprised that it took 40 years for someone to decide to do that one. It's set a year after the broadcasts and sees the Doctor embroiled in a plot regarding a murdered Russian spy, gangsters, and obviously Orson Welles himself, and it kind of has the feel of a 1950s B-movie about it. And yep, you guessed it, Mark Gatiss' name is on the writing credit. It's his second and final play for Bigfinish. You could probably tell if you didn't already know, as it's got all of his trademarks about it. It's an idea very typical of the Mark Gatiss that we know nowadays, and it's an idea that I'm a big fan of, but I was kind of dreading talking about this one because I don't want to come across as a hater, because whenever I talk about Mark, it's usually negative, and it seems like I have some sort of grudge against him or something, when I don't. I think he's a wonderful human being, and I've loved almost everything I've heard from him that's not a Doctor Who related product. For the most part. For the record, I really like Unquiet Dead. I know he hates anyone talking about it, but I did like the Probe series with Liz Shaw, and this third Doctor book I read several years ago was pretty decent, but Invaders from Mars is another of those. I like how much fun he clearly finds Doctor Who. All of his stories blatantly come from a place of preserved sense of childlike awe and a serious enthusiasm for the franchise, but it's another case of my feeling so lukewarm to something that has all the makings of a classic about it. You see, I was finding Mark Gatiss' Doctor Who work underwhelming way before it was cool. I'm a proper Doctor Who hipster. I think part of it might be because, while Invaders from Mars has a bit of a sense of humour about it, as it should, it's a trademark silly Mark Gatiss idea, but I feel the problem that I usually have with Mark on Doctor Who is, if you look at his work with Shearsmith and Pemberton, his sense of humour can be quite morbid, twisted and dark, but that never seems to show up in his work for Doctor Who for some reason. It usually comes out feeling kind of light and fluffy to me. Not a bad thing as such, but that might be part of why I usually feel a little bit out of place with Mark Gatiss' Doctor Who work. Contrasting that totally, next up we have quite possibly my favourite Doctor Who story of all time. Just next to Fury from the Deep. Just. Chimes of Midnight is an unrelentingly morbid Christmas special, and it's the ideal alternative if you, like me, start feeling sick anytime anyone suggests marathoning the new Who specials, particularly when anyone mentions the shitty Narnia one, because as we all know, Christmas is a dark and depressing time which is fit mostly for stories about violent idiosyncratic murder mysteries and a constant talk of suicide. Thank God! Rob Shearman gets it. The Doctor and Charlie wind up in an Edwardian household on Christmas Eve, where there's a murderer among the staff, and they have to take on the roles of amateur sleuths to find the killer, and as they do, they find that something isn't quite right with time here, and they find themselves trapped in the house, having to deduce who the killer is before he or she strikes again. I won't say much more about what makes this one such a genius piece of writing, because what usually happens with Rob Shearman scripts is giving too much of the game away ruins it. Honestly, he's like an advertiser's nightmare, for which he retains the title of coolest man in fiction. I will just say that Chimes was the first Bigfinish show I ever heard, and I will just never forget the first time I heard it. I can't really put my finger on why, but it just sort of seems to creep under your skin.
It's often said to be the best Bigfinish show, which is weird to think because it heavily relies on the story arc that Charlie was a part of, but it does work incredibly well on its own. I first heard it with absolutely no context and loved every second of it, because if there's one thing that Chimes does right, it's atmosphere. The sound design on this thing in particular is fucking superb. Another thing Chimes does incredibly right is characters. Yes, they are all stock from Agatha Christie novels, but that's kind of the whole point. It plays around with famous murder mystery tropes in a way that only Doctor Who would, and... look, just listen to this one, okay? My words do not do Chimes of Midnight justice. It's about as strong as they come, so if you, like me, are a morose little shit who sat through the twee gimmicky New Who specials that vomit rainbows from the screen, digging your fingernails into the sofa, I've made it a ritual to listen to this one every Christmas, and you should too. And it's only $2.99 on Bigfinish's website. What is your excuse? In between Chimes and Seasons of Fear, there was a tiny free one-part story called Living Legend, where the Doctor and Charlie have to try and stop some offbeat comedy character aliens from invading Earth, and it's precisely what you'd think it is. It is basically just a fairly tiny cackling villain plot. It's not bad for what it is, but I'd call it a free bit of promotional material for Bigfinish more than anything. Next up we have Seasons of Fear, which had the incredibly tricky task of following on from Chimes, which has gone on to have the reputation of Bigfinish's equivalent of Mother Teresa. But it managed to do so with much more dignity than I ever thought possible. I don't like it as much, obviously, given the verbal blowjob that I just gave Chimes, but Seasons of Fear is a fun, energetic little adventure that works in a way that not many people would expect at this point, and yet strangely you should be expecting it. You remember how back in Doctor Who's early days, when it was initially serialised fiction, Terry Nation attempted on 2 occasions with Marinus and the Chase to create a saga in which the Doctor and co hop between places week to week, and each episode was different and had its own identity, but at the same time were part of an overall story. Admittedly, Keys of Marinus isn't for everyone, but I really dig the approach, and Seasons of Fear borrows the template. The Doctor finally gets Charlie to Singapore, where he runs into an evil genius called Sebastian Grail, who claims that the Doctor saving Charlie from the R101 has changed history so that Earth in his future has been conquered by aliens, and he claims to have killed the Doctor in his past but the Doctor's future, so Charlie and the Doctor chase Grail throughout loads of different periods of history looking for the right version of him, as he's been to lots of periods of history and kind of exists in loads of different civilizations in a way that kind of reminded me of Blackadder a little bit, and they need to find the right version of Grail to unravel what's happened and fix the timeline. Now, that's a fucking awesome structure there. And I personally think that if Doctor Who as a movie actually happened, you know, a big sweeping epic Hollywood blockbuster, this is kind of how you would structure it. It totally captures Doctor Who's anywhere, anywhen premise within the trappings of a fun, spacey adventure plot. I will admit it does kind of slow up towards the middle of its second disc, but it's a really well-paced little adventure and I highly recommend it. Embrace the Darkness is next up, and like Sword of Orion, it's another Nick Briggs does atmosphere and sci-fi nonsense with the bus Formula 1. Loads of people are kinda lukewarm on it, but while it's not a favourite of mine, I personally think it's kind of underrated. It's a fine enough execution of the bus formula if ever I heard one. Basically, the Doctor and Charlie arrive in a system without light and unravel the mystery of what's happening to its sun, which kind of technically means that my illustrations for it should be solid black. This is the problem with trying to translate a non-visual medium to a visual one. And they encounter some terrified residents on a base on one of the darkened planets being subject to some strange creatures from the destroyed civilization who've evolved to adapt to the darkness. While kind of heavy-handed, as you can probably tell, and the ending's a bit rubbish, but it's a really grotesque little horror story, and as a teenager, I was really into grotesque little horror stories, because I'm kind of warped like that. It's a pretty dark and unsettling one, and even if it is precisely what you would call the standard bus formula in action, and not a whole lot that you've never heard before, but personally I think it's a better execution of this particular formula than most people would have you believe. Next up, I'm putting Solitaire in here because it is specifically noted that it's supposed to occur between these stories. It's a companion chronicle story, but unlike most in that series, it's basically a full two-hander. Basically, Charlie and the Celestial Toymaker are in his bizarre interdimensional toy shop, and Charlie has to play his game to find a way to escape. Really simple, yes, but it's highly effective. Some people may have been put off trying this one, since the Celestial Toymaker's debut story has a bit of a mixed reputation. The concept of the Toymaker was always a lot better than the story actually was. Yeah, on reflection, parts 2 and 3 are total filler. But Solitaire rebuilds the great concept into everything the initial story should have been. It's mysterious, spacey, weird, and incredibly sinister, and I would kind of describe it as the Crystal Maze told in the style of H.P. Lovecraft. Though yes, of course you know that Charlie will get out of the Toymaker's game alive, it still had me on the edge of my seat to see how she would throughout. I was already a big fan of hers, and she's on top form here. Bigfinish recently decided to give Charlie her own spin-off series, and rightly so in my book, because she totally deserves it based on Solitaire. Very few companions could carry their own spin-off series, but if any of them could, Charlie always ranked up there, and this one's a great little demonstration of why. Time of the Daleks is up next, and it's the 8th Doctor's first encounter with the aforementioned Pepper Potts, and unfortunately it wound up a bit of a damp squib. It's the future, and Earth's government are concerned that Shakespeare has been taken out of time, and the Doctor and Charlie show up to unravel said mystery of what happened to Shakespeare, and who could be behind what happened to Shakespeare? Could it be A, the Cybermen? B, the Autons? C, this picture of a snail that I drew? Or D, of course, it is the fucking Daleks behind it. What did you think was going on? They're on the cover. It is called Time of the Daleks. It sort of carries over from Seasons of Fear and Chimes, where it sets us up for the consequences of the Doctor changing history when he saved Charlie from the R101, which are fully followed through on in the next 2 stories. And you know, sounds like a great idea, time paradoxes and Daleks, stamp awesome all over that, but pretty much all of the interesting ideas that Time of the Daleks plays with are heavily borrowed from Evil of the Daleks. Not a bad thing, you may think. Evil of the Daleks was awesome, but it's not like Evil of the Daleks, it is Evil of the Daleks, specifically the first half. This is a trick that lots of Dalek stories tend to miss. The writers are usually too keen to Frankenstein together bits of past Dalek stories, hoping that lightning will strike twice, without really adding a whole lot of their own to it. I mean, look at Into the Dalek from last year, which was basically Dalek crossed with Fantastic Voyage. I mean, given they're over 50 years old by this point, alright, new ideas with the Daleks is a bit of a stretch at this point, but since this one didn't really do a whole lot of new things to make itself stand out from the canon's crowd of millions of Dalek stories that have happened by this point, and after a really promising opening episode and Daleks quoting Shakespeare, which is a lot of fun to listen to, yeah, my enthusiasm for it kind of fizzled out around the end of episode 2. Next up we have Neverland, a prelude to Bigfinish's 40th anniversary of Doctor Who release, and I highly recommend it, even if it is a bit of a prick tease, because you expect the follow-up to it to play out in a similar way. It's far from just a prologue to a bigger story though, its plot is a separate entity from Zagreus, and for all intents and purposes, it's pretty fucking great. The Time Lords have found out the Doctor rescuing Charlie from the R101 has caused the web of time to crack, which wreaks havoc throughout time and space, and to figure out how to fix it, they have to travel to an alternate universe of anti-time. Okay, you try coming up with an image to depict what a universe of anti-time looks like, where rogue Time Lords have been expelled from the universe over millennia as punishment by the Celestial Intervention Agency. Though the literary parallels with Peter Pan are screamingly obvious, and a tad heavy-handed in parts, Neverland is a fun, tightly plotted little piece with reveal after reveal that you never see coming, and strangely it manages to pull off something that should be impossible. Because when it comes to the lore surrounding Time Lord society, Romana's presidency on Gallifrey following her escape from E-Space, The Matrix, Rassilon, if you're familiar with all of it, it's a lot more fascinating than the classic show ever got with Time Lord canon, and it somehow manages to make the Doctor's backstory and own people intriguing and mysterious again, while showing us more stuff, which I've no idea how Barnes did it, but he did it. Yes, I will admit that it is kind of glorified continuity porn, but Neverland successfully manages to get over the "do we reveal too much" question that's been plaguing Doctor Who ever since its early days. A lot of fans have the rather relevant complaint that latter Doctor Who destroyed our marvelling at what the Doctor's backstory and own people could possibly have been like, and, well, yeah, they did. Beforehand, the Doctor was this mysterious traveller whose society operated in ways that we couldn't even begin to conceive, and now, here's the Time Lords, here's how the society works. Nothing's hidden anymore for you to wonder about. But Neverland hints that there's a fuck ton more stuff that we didn't realise that we didn't know yet, and while it reveals more of it, it leaves enough to your imagination and retains that air of mystery that leaves you with a feeling of awe. But yes, it is heavily part of the Charlie Shouldn't Be Alive arc, so yes, context is required, and also, if you listen to Neverland, yeah, the cliffhanger is really, really good, and you'll probably feel very inclined to listen to the follow-up, which... it's really, really controversial, and that's putting it very, very mildly. And so we come to another divisive one, possibly the most divisive Doctor Who story ever written. Wow, is this a massive talking point that I'm sure I'll have people berating me over. Zagreus. And before I start, it should come with this disclaimer. If you go into their 40th anniversary of Doctor Who release expecting something like the Five Doctors, you're going to be very disappointed. Basically, the Doctor and Charlie are trapped outside the universe, the Doctor's gone insane and is possessed by a monster from a Gallifreyan nursery rhyme, and reality splits open, and Charlie spends most of the runtime leaping between realities full of weird and obtuse Time Lord-related imagery, involving Rassilon's design of regeneration, the creation of Gallifrey and what came before it, and like last time with Neverland's Peter Pan illusions, with this one's creation of a weird trippy dreamscape. Duh, of course, it invokes and references Alice in Wonderland every 20 minutes or so, which is a popular, if tad overused, literary allusion for pulp sci-fi and horror, though Bigfinish had the excuse of this being made a long time before the entertainment industry finished milking Wonderland to death, and I personally don't think that's to its detriment, and hell, I like Alice in Wonderland as much as the next sci-fi horror nerd. Though if you started rolling your eyes when I first mentioned it, I honestly wouldn't blame you at this point, since Alice in Wonderland has kind of become the pulp fantasy equivalent of zombies in terms of overuse. It is very hard to find any two people that have the same opinion of Zagreus. Its mixed reception is understandable, and as someone who likes it, yes, I have to admit, it did fuck me off fairly often. Yes, anyone that's heard it, I am talking about that line, and it's about as highly flawed as it's possible to get. It's at least 70% flaw. It should not in any way have been 4 hours long, maybe 2.5 at best, and that's pushing it. Christ, does someone need to do a fan edit of this thing? The canned John Pertwee voice they recycled from a fan film he was in was made to be so distorted that you could barely hear it, so why bother including it at all again? Paul McGann didn't have nearly enough to do in the entire season-long duration, and when he did show up, he wasn't really the 8th Doctor. It does what Moffat does in lots of places and just uses layer upon layer of tedious continuity in place of actually being interesting with said continuity. It just sort of seems to be there for the sake of being there. Gary Russell has a strong tendency to use it as a box-ticking exercise more than anything. The ending was incredibly melodramatic because, as someone who's used the words soap opera in reference to Russell quite a lot, I just have to make a note of the fact there are many sequences in Zagreus that make you want to smash your fucking head against a brick wall. And it was so hard to follow that you'd need a fucking plot map to understand just what the hell it was going on about half the time. And yes, it is very, very pretentious. Which is a word that I feel is a tad overused, and people have a tendency these days to use it on anything attempting to be thought-provoking, but if the words profundity that has not been earned apply to anything, then by Christ do they apply to Zagreus. However, weirdly enough though, I simultaneously think it's one of the most imaginative, gutsy and daring things that Bigfinish have ever put out. And saying that your 50th release and 40th anniversary celebration that looks like a multi-Doctor story is going to be this downright insane, deranged, and adding some controversial canon messing things into the mix, I just appreciate the guts on display here. I like writers taking us outside of our comfort zone just to see what happens. While demented, I couldn't predict what Zagreus would do next, and I really liked that. And call me an obtuse shithead here, but I personally enjoy it a lot more than Day of the Doctor because of how unconventional they played it, and, well, I'll say it, I didn't think it was boring. Well, yeah, me saying that's totally indicative of needing to be the right sort of person to actually appreciate Zagreus, as lots of people do call it boring. Ardent Bigfinish fans and newer listeners alike. Though I mostly think that's down to it being 4 hours long, and yes, I will admit that quite a lot of it is totally unnecessary. It could have easily been 2 hours and been much more effective. I defy anyone to try and argue that that length is justified, but Zagreus just kept throwing so many new and unexpected things at me. I have to appreciate it for that. In this instance, Day of the Doctor is the mainstream blockbuster, Zagreus is the pretentious arty hipster movie. Not to say that it's a difference in intelligence level, that'd be really snobby of me. And I'm the guy that's always arguing that simpler can more often than not equal better, and as I just said, Zagreus desperately wants you to think it's much smarter than it actually is. Yes, it is kind of a preening smug bellend. I mostly just admire that they tried something different, weird, grandiose and out there, because since Bigfinish is a niche audience, they have more of an opportunity to do so, and I'm glad they took it, because you'll never hear anything else like it. 1 minute the Fifth Doctor is a mad scientist priest, the next Ace is a talking militant space duck. Yeah, the recasting of the regulars, Davison, McCoy, Baker, Courtney, Aldred, all in random dreamscape roles, I'm not as against that idea as some people, as going against the grain and what your audience would expect is a core ideal of fantasy writing, and I like that it gave them all a chance to play other roles, which, as a fan, when they do show up in other roles, you find it weird and unsettling, and weird and unsettling is kind of the whole point. While highly flawed, possibly the most flawed play in their catalogue, not worst, most flawed, but I appreciate Zagreus for what it is. It's far from a favourite of mine, and yes, Neverland was much better, but yeah, call me an obtuse little shit all you want over this one, but I admire what Zagreus went for. But yeah, just a warning, it is not for newcomers in any way, shape or form. Yeah, fun game. Try buying a copy of Zagreus for a friend who's only ever seen New Who before and watch their brain melt out through their ears. Alright, can a story be good if you need a roadmap and a fucking filing cabinet full of homework? Debatable, and it's one of my many criticisms of Moffat's Doctor Who, but unlike Moffat's Doctor Who, I wasn't totally bored by this point, and I was still very invested in Charlie, and hell, I enjoyed it for what it was, and if you enjoyed the Eighth Doctor up until now, well, you might. It is possible.